Okay, welcome to the Shir and Avodas HaParsha in the beautiful neighborhood of Shari Chesed, and the wonderful Kehillah of Ner Ephraim. Hope we're not in Shari Tzedek. If it should be only for Simchas. I kind of came onto a fascinating topic. I'll try to see whether the end came first before the beginning, or the beginning before the end. We'll explain. But first, let us mention is Le'ili Nishmas. Yaakov ben Menachem, whose yahrzeit is tonight. So the first pasuk in Bamidbar, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe b'Midbar Sinai b'Oel Moed, ve'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana hasheni l'tzeisam eretz Mitzrayim lemor. There are a lot of things on that pasuk, on the dates in the pasuk, on all these things. But here there's a medrash that seems very strange to be here on this pasuk. This is what the medrash says. The first parak of the Medrash Rabbah, Ashrav Shel Moshe. Right, this is like how fortunate Moshe Rabeinu is. Sheshishim ribo omdim, that 600,000 Jews, meaning that core of Am Yisrael, are all standing. V'akohanim, v'alavim, v'azakenim, hakol omdim sham. They're all standing there. Umikulam lo nidbar Elohim Moshe. And from all those people, Hashem only spoke to Moshe. Now, the questions pop up automatically in our head. And I'm going to be going through the ones brought by the Sifsei Tzadik. The Sifsei Tzadik was Rav Pinchas of Piltz. He was both the cousin and brother-in-law of the Emes. Right? He was, he was the Rav in Piltz there, and he was a chassid of his cousin, the Emes. So he says like this. He says, why, among all the psukim we had in the Torah, does the Medrash suddenly come here and say, Ashrav Shel Moshe, look at that. All of Am Yisrael's there, Kohanim, Zkenim, everybody, and Hashem only speaks to you. Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabeinu many times before this, right? In Mitzrayim, at Matan Torah, and all these things. Why? He said that was always the way it went. So he explains like this. He says, he has two approaches to it. This is the first one. He said something very special happened here. He quotes the Trumas Hadeshen, who says that this pasuk here is the first time Hashem spoke to Moshe after the Mishkan was completed. Okay, that's where we're bumping into this year, in the second year, and this was the first speaking. Now, the process of building the Mishkan was an entire process of tshuva for Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael went from Matan Torah, from Har Sinai, from all the levels that they had reached during their Severos HaOmer, so to speak, to be able to receive the Torah. And then we had the Luchos, broken after the Chet HaEgel. And eventually they were told to build the Mishkan where they would put these second Luchos. Now, the purpose of the Mishkan, as it says in the Pasuk, is V'shachanti b'socham, that Hashem is going to dwell among them. So as the Mishkan was being built, Am Yisrael were doing the internal avodah to be prepared that Hashem should be able to dwell among them, that the Shekhinah can be there with them. And they were purifying their hearts, and they were working on their midos, and they built the Mishkan. The Shekhinah came, and they were really at that level. So Moshe Rabeinu, who was the most humble person on earth, assumed that now I'm just one of the crowd. Baruch Hashem, they all reached the level like I was at. So Hashem was going to speak to somebody, right? He didn't particularly feel that there's reason for Hashem to speak to him. And he also felt that this Hashras Hashchina now that was coming, Hashem speaking, was a result of this entire process of going through the Chet HaEgel and repairing the damage and doing the tshuva and getting the Mishkan. And he wasn't part of that process. So he figured now that Am Yisrael achieved such a thing, maybe it's like the idea that they say that Mokum Shebali Tshuva Omdim Ein Tzadikim Gemurim Micholim Lamod. They went through a process that he didn't go through. So he felt probably Hashem will now speak to someone who is connected to that process. For example, Aaron. right? That Aaron had a connection to the Chet HaEgel, right? He wasn't an instigator, obviously, and in fact, he's mentioned later on in this parsha, right? That he's told to Atav Aaron. Oh, hi Barry. Hello. Okay, so Aaron is mentioned there. So he says, and in fact, we find the command that Hashem gave here was in the Lashon Rabim, was in the plural, and it finishes Atov Aaron, you and Aaron. But nonetheless, the Dibur came to Moshe Rabeinu, meaning even with Am Yisrael at their peak, Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabeinu and sent the command on through him. So this is what we understand when the Medrash says, Hakol omdim sham, they were all standing there. Of course, they were, in other words, that they were in the desert, they were in the camp, they were around the Mishkan. Omdim sham means they were at the level. They were standing at the level that they would be able to receive from Hashem. They would be able to receive nevuah, to receive prophecy. Nonetheless, Hashem chose to speak through Moshe because that which would come through Moshe Rabeinu, he says, was as if hearing it from Mipi Agvur, from Hashem. Because Moshe Rabeinu was greater than Malachim, greater than angels. So therefore, when they were fitting for Nevuah, it came through Moshe. Now we're going to explore why it had to come through Moshe. In other words, we see that's the statement that was made, and that's what the Medrash is saying, that even though everyone was on that level, and we know that the Animamins, right, from the Rambam, the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu's uniqueness and the uniqueness of his Nevuah is part of our fundamentals.
Greater than what Torah?
What that Am Yisrael reached a level greater than what they were at Matan Torah? Oh, exactly. So we're going to look at that point where Hashem, they heard the first two Dibros, and they approached Moshe, and they said, Hashem speak to you, or else we're going to die. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. That's excellent. Okay, his second mahalach here, just to mention it before continuing on with the first one, is that he said that it's true, Am Yisrael managed to reach that level, but it all came from Moshe, right? Meaning, Moshe Rabeinu wasn't just taking care of himself and his learning and his avoda. He was the leader of Am Yisrael. He was focused on Am Yisrael. And Am Yisrael's achievement to be able to reach that level of purity, that they would be ready for the Hashras HaShechina, that came from Moshe. And he brings from his grandfather, Chidush Urim, he says that was Korach's mistake. Korach, number one, in terms of himself, he felt that he was on the same level as Moshe and Aaron. And he says, it could be he was feeling something true, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to be, so to speak, a Talmud of Moshe Rabeinu, because you got that from Moshe Rabeinu. Moshe Rabeinu helped you do that. He did it for you. And what Korach said, Kol ha'edo kulam kadoshim. All of Am Yisrael are kadosh, u'v'socham Hashem. That's what he's saying. Look, the Mishkan is here, v'shachanti b'socham. That's true. But it came through Moshe. It came by means of Moshe. Opi Hashem b'yad Moshe. So now, let's try to look at something that Rav Hutner explains in his what's called the Sefer Mamorei Pachad Yitzchak on Sukkot. This was the later volumes of the Pachad Yitzchak series that were brought out by his daughter and son-in-law, St. David Yibor L'chaim, St. Bruya Aleh Shalom. So he is speaking about Moshe Rabeinu here, and he quotes a very curious Rambam. The Rambam in Ilchos Sanhedrin talks about Am Yisrael's obligation to set up Batei Din and the idea of the Sanhedrin. And he says like this, Kama Batei Dinim kvuim yu b'Yisrael v'kama yeh minyonam. How many set Batei Din are supposed to be set up in Am Yisrael, and how many Dayanim are supposed to be there? It says, Kovin b'tchila, the first Beis Din we set up is Beis Din HaGadol Bamikdash. Hu Nikra Sanhedrin Gedola. This Beis Din, the big Beis Din, the high Beis Din, and that was Minyonim Echad V'Shivim. And there were 71 Dayanim in there. Where do we get that number? Because in Parshas Baloscha, right, when Hashem tells Moshe to appoint Shoftim under him, it says, Esfali Shivim Ish Miziknei Yisrael. So that's the 70. Where was the one? That was Moshe Rabeinu. Moshe al gabeim, and Moshe is above them, as the pasuk says, "V'yatzvu sham imach." They will stand there with you. Hence 71. Now comes the curious phrase: Hagadol b'chochma shebekulan. The person with the greatest wisdom among the 71, Moshivin also Rosh Aleim. He is appointed to be the Rosh Beis Din. Who Rosh HaYeshiva, who Shekorin also Chachamim Nosi B'chol Makom. That position was the one that was called the Nosi, right? V'hu ha'omed tachas Moshe Rabeinu, and he stands in the place of Moshe Rabeinu. Meaning, just like was Moshe Rabeinu in 70 Dayanim to make up the original 71, here you have this Nosi and the other 70, and it says that he stands in the place of Moshe Rabeinu. It's just strange. So Rav Hutner says like this. He says he's approached this Rambam in different ways. But, that every Av Beis Din stands in the place of Moshe Rabeinu. Why phrase it like that? In other words, say he's right. That's the comparison to Moshe Rabeinu. So he wants to start with the following story that's brought in the Gemara, a puzzling story. It says that when Chana brought Shmuel to the Mishkan to assist Eli, so he felt that something was being done wrong in halacha. Right? That Eli had called for a kohen to shech the korban, and he said the kohen doesn't have to shech the korban. Right? It's only from the stage of Kabbalah and on. It's kohanim. Shechita is ksher bezar. So Eli HaKohen said, "What you say is true, but you were more halacha bifnei Rabbo. You have, decided halacha in front of your Rebbe, and therefore you chayv misa. Okay, you are liable of the death penalty. Chana intervened, and it goes on there, and he was saved. Now, Tosfos asked there, why is he mora halacha bifnei Rabbo? He's passing in front of his Rebbe. He didn't even learn anything yet from Eli. He just came right then, right? How could that be? Okay, so Tosfos answered, the afal gav shlo lomad adayin b'fonov, even though Shmuel had not yet learned from Eli, mikomakom, kiven she'Eli haya gadol hador, Eli was the gadol hador, u'Shmuel ba lilmod lefonov, and Shmuel came to learn from him, nechshav mora halacha b'fnei Rabbo. That combination of Eli being the gadol hador and Shmuel coming to learn from him. Who is
he borrowed to somewhere? Which always means that that's you're the Rav, and he
Yeah.
has a question. No, I answered him.
Oh, so it's so right. If you look in the Gemara there in Brachos, it seems that he actually told them, right, not to bring a kohen. It seems that, and in Eli's presence, all this, So that's what we had. But the question is, how did it even start? So he says, here we have a great chiddush. He says, and this goes back to Moshe Rabeinu. If you look at the description in Sefer Dvarim of Matan Torah, and this is the pasuk you mentioned, when Am Yisrael heard this voice at Matan Torah, this frightening sound, the voice, so Moshe Rabeinu is recounting this in Sefer Dvarim, what happened in Matan Torah, that you all came close to me, the heads of your shvatim and zkeni vatomru, kravata ushma, please you draw close to Hashem and hear es kol asher yomer Hashem Elokeinu, right? Everything Hashem says to us, va'at tedaber eleinu, and then you will speak to us, say over to us, kol asher yedaber Hashem Elokeinu eilecha, v'shamanu v'osinu, and we will listen to what you say, and so we will do. So he says, what's happening here is Am Yisrael asking Moshe Rabeinu to be their Rav. He said it's as if, like sometimes the Kehillah in the old days, there would be a whole ceremony, they would give a Ksav Rabbonos, to the Rav of the Kehillah. So here, Am Yisrael are giving Moshe Rabeinu a Ksav Rabbonos. Now he says, this pasuk appears in the midst of the description of Matan Torah. The end of the description of Matan Torah is Shuva lachem la'alechem, when Am Yisrael told, go back to their tents. Everything before that is an essential part of Matan Torah, and therefore, when we're told we're supposed to learn Torah kinesinosa misinai, as it was given at Sinai, so this is also part of learning Torah. The approach to the Rav, who is this, as he phrases here, this Gadol Hador, and coming and accepting him as your Rav. And the very coming alone is this Kabbalah of Moshe Rabeinu as the Rav, and he says this is the Yesod for Kabbalah's Gadol Hador B'chol Hadoros. In other words, at least in simpler times, when you had there the Nasi of the Sanhedrin was Kavua as the Gadol Hador, so therefore he says it had to be that people accepted him upon themselves, and that was how the Masorah went. That was how it would be. So that's how he stands in the place of Moshe Rabeinu. And he says, if Am Yisrael had not accepted Moshe Rabeinu as a Rav, he wouldn't be that Rav. We wouldn't call him Moshe Rabeinu. He says, and that chain of Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai Umasora would have been Bata. So this, he said, is that combination that Tosfos mentioned, those two things. Ba the fun of Lilmud. He says, and because Eli was Gadol Hador. He says, how do you know, first of all, if someone comes before the Rav, how do you know that the Rav wants to give to this Talmud? So he says the very essence of the Gadol Hador is to teach the generation. So that's not even held as a question, right? But when the person comes, then you have this connection of what's called the Moser and Makabel. Okay, so the one who gives over the tradition and the one who receives. Now, he mentions at the end of this mimer that somebody asked him, but Am Yisrael were talking to Moshe Rabeinu then as a Novi, as a prophet. They weren't talking to him as a Rav, as a teacher in Posek. They were saying, we can't, right, exist hearing directly from Hashem. So please, you do the Nevuah, and then you bring it to us. So how can you connect it to this idea of being the Rav? So Rashi said, Moshe Yashofet v'dayan al pi hadibur v'shokol k'sanhedrin gedol v'Yerushalayim. He said Moshe Rabeinu was unique in that in him the idea of nevuah and dayanus were one and the same. Right? Usually we have an idea that the Navi is not the posik, and we don't paskin al pi, right? The lo b'shamayim hi. But with Moshe Rabeinu this was so. And therefore, he said, this idea of accepting Moshe Rabeinu as a Rav, that was what was happening there when they said this. Okay, so this is how he explains that puzzling Gemara, this puzzling idea of Shmuel, and this idea of the need to have Moshe Rabeinu and to accept Moshe Rabeinu in order for this to come. Meaning, if we go back to our pasuk in Bamidbar and what the Sifsei Chaim asked, and the surprising thing, if Am Yisrael were all on this level, and Moshe Rabeinu was surprised, and suddenly it's this tremendous praise for him, that among all these people, Hashem chooses him, whatever level they're at, we see that it's a necessary part of the continuation of Matan Torah that Hashem speak to Moshe, the Rebbe, and that Am Yisrael accept from him, that they're makabel him, and that's how it goes. Okay, so those are the 2 points we have so far. Now I'm going to explain why I got a little excited about it. It was just Lag Bomer, not long ago, and somebody was asking me, why do people, number one, feel a connection to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai if they didn't even learn, right, Zohar, etc., even though he appears, Talmud Rebbe said 4,600 times he's mentioned in the Talmud Bavli. Right, so there's a lot we learned from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even aside from the Zohar. And why is it you can learn his Torah without feeling connected to him? What is this idea of being connected to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? So this is a little kuntras. There's a Talmud of Rabbi Meir Morgenstern. He brings out these things that explain his Rebbe's Torah in a way which is a bit more understandable, a bit less heavy Kabbalah. And he has a little piece about this. So what I loved about this is he asked a question. I sometimes love it when a question is asked about something that I've just assumed with my mother's milk, and the very fact that you asked the question like throws me for a loop. He says, first of all, we can ask, why do we need Moshe Rabeinu? And why do we need Mashiach? This concept that Hashem is eventually going to reveal himself and redeem us, and it's going to be through this person, Mashiach ben David. Why do we need him? Why can't Hashem just go directly to everybody and change the world as he wants? So it's all the same question, right, in these different forms. And we see that it is necessary, right, that it's there. So he explains like this. He says, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did bring down particular aspects of Torah that were hidden. Moshe Shapiro Zatzal explained it like he said, it was like Torah from the future that he was allowed to bring into the present. It's he says, and we really can't understand what he taught in its true depth, right? However, if we are connected to him as one of his people, as one of his Talmidim, and he understood these things, so then this influences us as well. Even if we don't reach the same depth, but when we get to the level that we're able to get to, it's authentic, it's integral, it's part of it because it comes from him. He says, Am Yisrael are one neshama, and a Tzadik Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the head, so to speak, of this one spiritual body. And when the head understands something, I don't say, oh, my brain understands that now. I understand that, right? That's how it all works. So he says, when people are connecting to a tzaddik, right? He says, what we're trying to do is to connect to the Torah as he received it, as he brought it in, and we're able to then, each at our own level, connect to it and to benefit from it. Okay, so this is that connection. Now, the question of who and what and how these connections are. So he brings this idea. He says, for example, the Geula, right, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is it's going to be a new world. Eretz Chadosh, Shamayim Chadoshim, Or Chadosh Al Tzion Torah. There's going to be this new light. It's going to come into the world, but he says there has to be at least one person who is able to receive that light entirely. Someone who has purified themselves to the extent, who has the midos, who has the anova, who has all these things, that he will be able to receive it completely. And then, once there is such a person who brings that into the world, then Am Yisrael will be able to receive it as well. So that's why we shouldn't be put off when we see the Torah is called Torah's Moshe Avdi, the Torah of Moshe. Wait, but the Torah is given to all of Am Yisrael. That's true. Moshe is us. He's the head, so to speak. And through him, we all get that. And only because of who he was are we able to do so. Okay, so this, I think, was just a nice idea of this picture because this person was portraying it as some kind of cult of personality or something like this. Is not true. It's the idea of connecting to something. Now, Rav Hutner got into a bit more details into that piece. The question is, who and how this is, what people have this. So he said, we find that at certain times in history, Am Yisrael accepted the Gadol Ador not just on themselves, but for all generations. And this has to do with what we call Chasimas HaMishnah, the sealing of the Mishnah, or Chasimas HaTalmud. Meaning we have these concepts, your basics when you're learning Gemara is, an Amara cannot be cholek on a Tana. An Amara cannot contradict a Tana. When you're arguing in the Gemara and you'll say, right, I have here in the Mishnah, it says not like this, unless he has another Tana who goes like him, another Tanaic source, as they call it, he cannot do that because the Mishnah is sealed. You can't go and start undoing the Mishnah. So too, after Ravami and Ravashi added on with the Rabbanan Savarai and the changes they made for it, the Talmud Bavli was sealed. And from that time, nobody can contradict the Talmud Bavli. He says, so it must be that the acceptance of Rebbe, and that was the uniqueness of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi in that generation, and the acceptance of Ami and Rav Ashi and their ability to complete and seal that Talmud in history is something that was accepted by Am Yisrael even for all generations. Meaning there's a qualitative difference that happens sometime that Am Yisrael are aware of. Moshe Rabeinu is Rabeinu always. Perhaps the very fact that we call Rabbi Yehuda Nossi Rebbe, right, in these things, because that was something very unique that came and happened, and its authority that came is something they accept. The Beis Yosef, perhaps the idea of the Shulchan Aruch, as he formulated it, also became a baseline. It's based on the Rishonim, on the Rambam, on the Rosh, etc. But this is something. So we see that the idea of Am Yisrael accepting something connects us to it, certainly in the generation itself, but in certain times there are these key figures who, and perhaps that stand in the place of Moshe Rabeinu, not just for that generation, but that this is giving a Torah in a level in which this is going to go on forever. It's an interesting thought, which is there. But what this shows is that a very part and parcel of Matan Torah is this idea of coming and wanting to receive, of recognizing that Hashem gives the Torah to us through a unique individual, and that's not that it's not given to all of Am Yisrael, but that's how we get it. And recognizing that, accepting that, and stepping forward to come, right, to come and learn from him. And maybe that is why people like to go to Miran. They're like making that statement, Balifnei Rabbo, like Shmuel coming to Eli, right, that we're here, we want to be part of this. And that's the only way the Messiah of Am Yisrael goes on.